Paul does is he starts off laying out one kind of principle or one idea, and then he gives some examples to explain what he means before he comes into the main point of his text. And so what I want to do is read starting in verse 17, and I'm only going to read verse 17, and then I'm going to jump ahead to verse 25. And I'm doing that not because verses 18 through 24 are not important, but just because those are those two illustrations, and I'll try to summarize those in a couple moments. But just as our reading, I think I'm just going to read that, what I just said, verse 17, and then again 25 through the end, and you'll see that that's in itself is fairly lengthy. So let's I'll read this tonight, and then we'll kind of do some study of it together. So 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 17. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Now jump to verse 25. Now about virgins I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as though they have none. Those who mourn, as if they did not. Those who are happy, as if they were not. Those who buy something, as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world, as if not engrossed in them. For this world, in its present form, is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of the world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if she is getting along in years and he feels he ought to marry, he should do so as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does even better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So, Haley, let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to have us do what we've done here a few times before. Just kind of go back through real quick and maybe try to see if you could break it down or find marks or paragraph markers in the text, places where Paul seems to be addressing a few different issues. See if you can identify that, and also then look for any words that are repeated. And I'll just give you a couple minutes to do that. We won't spend a whole lot of time on that, but go through and see if you can find how Paul thematically divides this rather long text up, and look for any words. And you can, of course, do that with those next to you or on your own. Either way is fine. And I'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes for that. And the other thing to look for, too, is just see if you can find out what is that key principle that Paul is laying down here and then interpreting and applying in different ways. do about one more minute. Okay. Let's start with this. What is the the main idea or the main principle that Paul is working with here? He spells it out and then he kind of repeats it. What is that main idea that you found? Yeah, David. Right. That's right. That's right. He repeats that by my count 6 times in this text. Part of that, a couple of those times were not in the section that we read, but that gives you 6 times where Paul says some variation of that. Remain as you were called, or retain your status. So that's the idea that Paul lays out, and in a minute I'll show you a little. This is how he kind of structures the text a little bit. But before we get to that, I want to ask you the question: why do you think Paul is writing this? Now, we talked last week about telephone listening, where you hear one side of the conversation and you have to try to guess, deduce what the other side of the conversation is. So, as Paul says this, remain as you were called. What's the other side of the conversation? What might be going on in the Corinthian church that might lead Paul to answer them as he does here? That's right. And so let's even be more specific now that I'm a believer, and what else? What am I supposed to do about what? That's right. Marriage, stay married, get divorced, remain single, look for a spouse, don't look for a spouse, right? Has to do with marital status in light of being a believer, and then as David points out, in light of the present distress or the present crisis, which we'll come back to in a minute because that raises a whole bunch of other questions, I think. So that's right. That gets at the heart of it, right? And as believers, now that I've become a Christian, do I have to go off and get married? Should I stay single? What do I do? Or if I am married, do I have to leave my spouse? Right. So all those kinds of questions. Um, what are some other repeated words in this, just to kind of put those in our mind as well, because that will also give us a hint about what this is really all about. Other repeated words. Concern. Yep. Yeah, you see that. That's right. I'm trying to think if mine. That's right. Yeah, mine even. I used the ESV the first time I went through, and it's anxious. So your anxiousness or your worries, what is it that's consuming your attention and maybe making you anxious or concerned? That's right. What else? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes. That's that's right, and that gets into that present distress that David pointed out, and that Paul is talking about there in verse 26. So, I'm going to say a little more about that, what exactly that is. I heard Cheryl. I don't know if you were going to point divided and undivided. That's right. So your loyalties. Where are you? Where the loyalties of your heart lie? David, what else? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, and that's a good segue. Hey, let's go to the next slide, because Paul, here's kind of how I asked you earlier to see if you could find how Paul structures this, and I think this is kind of a rough way that you might do it, and that will kind of bring out what you're getting at there. So Paul's main principle there, he spells that out in verse 17: "Remain as you were called," and he says, "I have this rule wherever I go." So it's kind of one of Paul's core principles, but then he applies that first, and it's like he's giving an illustration, two illustrations. He first says, if you were circumcised, remain, don't try to undo that, which apparently you could do in those days. I didn't know that, but you could. if you are uncircumcised, don't feel like you need to go get circumcised. So he applies that in the religious context there in verses 17 verses 18 and 19. And then he applies it a second time in the question of slavery, verses 21 through 23. So Paul is taking that principle and he's applying it religiously, as in the area of religion, and then he applies it a second time in the area of social status, which would be slavery or freed person. Now, just a quick little comment on that, because we hear slavery and we immediately think, the South, 1800s, and slavery in first century Greece and Rome was different. It wasn't still a great thing, but it was not the same thing either. And I'll just note a couple of little differences. One of them was that in Corinth, about a third of the people, I think 2/3 of the people, as many as 2/3 of the people were slaves. And a lot of times what people would do is they would sell themselves into slavery to pay off debt. And so, you could do it willingly and you could do it of your own volition. And it wasn't a race-based thing, which is one of the key differences, right? And so, now that said, it wasn't like a pleasant institution. You could have a boss who would be very cruel and beat you and so on. But you also could have a boss who would treat you pretty well and you'd actually have a fairly decent life. And then when you pay off your debt, then you could be set free. Or someone else could come along and pay your debt off and then you'd be set free. That was called manumission of slaves. So I just kind of put that out there because in our minds we hear slavery and we think, well, Paul is endorsing what we had in the South, and that's not true. He's just referring to the institution of slavery as they knew it in the first century. So, but the point is, that was a little diversion there, but the point is Paul's taking that principle, remain as you are, he applies it to religious context, then he applies it to a social context, then he comes back to it, and he repeats it in verse 24. As I said, remain as you were called. And then he says, now I'm going to get into the main point of what I'm trying to talk about. And he applies it first to marriage in these difficult days, right, this present time. And then in verses 29, then he says, let's talk about what this means for marriage for right now, for this appointed, for this present time, verse 29, I think it is. So, the appointed time has grown short. So he applies it to marriage in kind of in two ways. First, to talk about these difficult times, and then marriage for the present time. So the question is, what does Paul mean when he's talking about these difficult times? And David raised that, and I think someone else alluded to it as well. So let's talk about that. Let's go to the next slide there, Haley. So I'm going to toss this out to you first and just kind of see. Doris, you had kind of touched on this as well. So in view of the present distress, Paul says, remain as you are. Now the question is, what is the present distress? And you see a couple of ideas up there. It's possible, well, it's not possible, it was a reality that there was a famine going on in Jerusalem. There were some political and social tensions that were really widespread in Corinth and in the Middle East. There was persecution against Christians. And so what Paul seems to be saying there in verse 26 is it seems like he's applying these words first to a very localized context. In other words, if you're a Christian and you know that the government is out to get you and persecute you and maybe throw you in jail and maybe, torture you or even kill you, then Paul seems to be saying, if you go and get married, you're going to be creating a situation where you're going to be separated from your wife and maybe children. And so Paul says, in this local specific setting, it's going to spare you a lot of hardship if you don't get married. See how that works there? So Paul is saying, life is tough for us as believers right now, and it might spare you some grief and heartache if you don't get married. And I point that out because that keeps us from coming to the conclusion that Paul is somehow completely anti-marriage, that he's saying you should never get married, because it's not what he's really getting at there. So he's saying, look, in view of this present distress that we're going through right now, it may be better for you to not change your status. Any questions or thoughts on that? Yeah, Doris. Yeah, good question. Was because then that raises the issue of who is really going to read this and who does it apply to? And I think the answer is it most specifically would have been read by the Corinthians, but in good time, the letter would have been circulated to many others. And the reality is that persecution had spread pretty far by the time by the time the letter to the Corinthians was written. So the persecution started in Jerusalem. There was a real outbreak of persecution in Jerusalem by about the year 34, 35, somewhere in there, right shortly after Jesus died. And that persecution actually scattered the believers all over the place. But then so for a time they were free from some of that persecution because they got away from the epicenter of it. But it wasn't long, and the persecution caught up with them. The Roman government was very hostile to Christians, and that was pretty universal at that time. So it would have been read by those in Jerusalem, but it would have been read much more widely than that as well. And it would have the hardship would have been not just for those in Jerusalem, but all over the place. Yeah. hmm That's right. That's right. Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. hmm Or or they suffer sort of people don't want to do business with the Christians, or it's sort of like the tide of the culture had turned against Christians, and so wherever they were, they're facing it. Whether it's a formal, Emperor Nero and his soldiers hunting you down, or just people don't like Christians because they're so intolerant or whatever. We sort of hear that sometimes today as well. Yeah, David. hmm Right. Yes, that's right. It's both and. That's right. So that's a good segue because it seems what Paul is doing is he's saying, okay, we know that as Christians we're living with a lot of hostility and it's pretty intense right now. But then it's like he expands on that in verse 29 where he says, because he starts off by talking about the appointed time. Now, that's one of those words that over time you sort of learn to red flag in your minds because it has a very specific meaning. In fact, did I put that up? Yeah, I did. Appointed time, the Greek is the word kairos, which is not just like chronos, right? There's two kinds of time. Here's your extra little lesson for the night. Chronos is like your time on the watch, like what time is it and how much time do we have left? And that's referring just to the passage of, seconds and minutes and hours and days. But kairos is a different kind of time. That's the appointed time. And in the Bible, you'll find it used in reference. I put a couple things out there, just a couple of examples. The harvest was a kairos. That was a sort of a moment that was appointed on the calendar that we expect this time of fulfillment to come. And it's used most frequently in the New Testament to talk about Jesus' appointed time, right? So Jesus says to his disciples in John chapter 2 and repeatedly through John, "My time has not yet come." And, especially in the story of the wedding at Cana, right? He says, I'm sorry, I can't do this sign. My time has not yet come. And then he gets up and he does the sign, and we're all wondering, what is that about? And the reason is what Jesus is referring to is not the time to do the miracle, but his appointed time on the cross. Because later on in John, he says, okay, my time has come, and then he suffers. And so all that to say, that was a very lengthy way of saying that when Paul starts talking in verse 29 about the appointed time, he's really talking about life in light of the resurrection of Jesus. So we're in a new era of redemptive history. After Jesus has gone to the cross, after he's risen from the dead, everything is different now. Everything has changed in light of the cross. And so that's why he says, because if you read through verse 30, the rest of 29 and 30 and 31, some of the things Paul is saying there are really strange. Like he says, those who are mourning should not, act as if they're not mourning. Those who do business act as if it's, they're not doing of anything, right? So he says, and we're kind of left scratching our head, like, what is Paul really saying? And the answer to that is really Paul is just calling the church to live in light of the resurrection. And so when he says live, those who mourn as though they were not mourning, he's not saying just, put on the stiff upper lip and just pretend you're not sad. He's really saying, look at your mourning through the lens of the resurrection, which means that mourning and grief is different. It's now sort of a temporal thing. We recognize that mourning will give way to rejoicing one day. And marriage or unmarriage is a temporal thing. In other words, Paul doesn't, what he's really getting at, maybe this, Haley, we can go to the next slide here. Because what Paul is getting at is the gospel changes social institutions, and it changes how we look at social standing. Right? So in first century time, marriage was huge, if not for the romantic sort of Valentine Day reasons that we might use today, but marriage was so important because it gave you social security, right, and stability and income and standing in the society. And so if you were an unmarried person, it wasn't just that, well, you might be a little lonely from time to time, as tough as that might be, but it was, who's going to care for you? Who's going to look out for you? Who's going to give you a place of significance in the world? And so single people were often looked at as very, second-tier people. And so then, in other words, the desire to marry becomes, I need to marry because I need to have some place in the community. I need to be someone. And Paul says, no, the gospel changes all of that. Your social identity, your social standing are not defined by whether or not you're married or single. Your social standing is defined in light of the resurrection. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? I'll give you a chance to ask questions or respond. Mm-hmm. That's right. No, that's right. They did not. We do. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it seems you read through Paul's letters, and it seems that he does have that sometimes too. Now, again, you look at it, it also could be that Paul's understanding of the time being short is different as well. Like, so there's that. But in any case, you're right. I mean, we've got sort of 2,000 years now, and we look back, but it all makes sense, right? Because we're still living in the last days, but that's not a chronos thing, that's a kairos thing. This is the last season before Jesus returns, and however long these last days may be, we don't know, but we know that it is the last days before the return of Jesus. Yeah, David. That's right. Right. Good point. That's right. So time being short is there's always that sense of urgency, right? We can't say, well, we're in the last days and this could go on forever. The last days are meant to be. There's a sense of urgency here. You don't know when it's going to end, so be ready. Now, don't live with that sense of fear of, well, just be ready. And then, as we said this morning, go about your life. I mean, do your thing. So a couple of, what are some of the implications then, and kind of that's the framework, what are some of the implications then that Paul builds out of this when he applies this? How does he apply it? I put a couple of thoughts up on there in front of you, but look at your text as well to see if you can see, how does Paul apply this principle to married, unmarried, and single people? Mm-hmm. Pure devotion to the Lord. Yeah. Yep. I'm sure they did, right? Now, in some ways that's correct, right? I mean, there's something about, being devoted to the Lord and just giving your focus there. Now, in the case, I think, of the Roman Catholic tradition, they make it an all or nothing thing. You're either single in the monastery or with the other monks or the nuns, and you're devoted to the Lord only, or you're married and you can't really be engaged in that. And yeah, that's very problematic. But in any case, Paul does say, look, if you are single, and I guess I would say it this way, if you are single for whatever reason, use that as an opportunity to devote yourself to the Lord. Right? Again, don't feel like you have to go and join a monastery or a convent or something. Yeah, Doris. Mm-hmm. That's right. In the first century, you mean, like when Paul was writing this, did they have? Not usually. Unless you were talking, like the leaders, they might have had more than one. That might have been more of a political arrangement than anything else. But in general, people were, by that point, they were married generally to one person. Although Paul does say that being married just to one person, and it seems that by that point polygamy was generally on its way out as a practice. So, what other application do you see here as Paul takes this idea and applies it to the Corinthians? Is it fair to say that Paul prefers singleness over marriage, or is that stretching it? What do you think? Yeah. Yeah, he was single, so he says, look, we talked today about the gift of singleness, and back in college, there were people that said that's a gift I'd rather not have, but I think really it for some people it is a gift, and they're able then to devote themselves to the Lord. But then Paul, he says, again, if you're married, great. If you want to get married, fine. You're not doing anything wrong by it. It's not a question of right and wrong and morality. It's a question of wisdom, and God's calling you to devote yourself to serving Him, then do that. But don't feel like you need to go and seek a spouse in order to find some standing in the community. In fact, he even says marriage, I think I have the verse up there, I forgot to put the verse reference, but marriage should be preferred if singleness is going to lead you into sin, and if that's going to leave you vulnerable to temptation. So Paul says, then you should really get married. Okay, any other thoughts on that? We covered a fair bit of ground. That's a pretty lengthy text, and so we kind of have to fly a little higher above it to get most of it, but I don't want to leave anything out. If you have any other questions or thoughts on this. All right, then. If not, next week we're going to look at, your NIV has the heading, Food Sacrifice to Idols, which is another, it's kind of, to me, it's a fascinating thing. It goes back to a practice in Corinth that they'd sell discount meat that had been used at the temple for idol worship, and the Corinthians wanted to get a good bargain on their steak, and so can we buy this meat or not? So anyways, we'll talk about that and how that actually does have relevance to us today, as far removed as it might sound. But let's close in prayer together. Father, we thank you again for your word. We thank you that even as your word continues to speak into a context that in some ways was very different from ours, it raises and answers some of the same questions that we face today. We thank you that because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, there's a whole new way to look at life. There's a whole new way to live in the world around us. We aren't defined by marital status. We aren't defined by whether or not we're married or single or divorced or widowed, but we're defined by knowing Jesus and by being claimed by Him and adopted through Him into your family. And so we don't need to give in to that social pressure to define ourselves by relationships. We don't need to, even as